you said regarding the CalWORKs childcare. It's stated in here that you thought this might be a little severe. Could you elaborate on why and how you come to that conclusion?
Sure. I mean, it is reducing the amount of money that a large number of families will be receiving if the governor's proposal is adopted. They'll be shifting to sort of a full family grant to what we used to call a child-only grant. So there'll be some significant reductions in the amount of income for those families. In addition, there'll be a large number of families that won't be eligible for the same level of child care and employment and other services that they now receive. So we've made a lot of significant changes in this program over the last several years, and now the governor's proposing yet more significant proposals. So while we think they're definitely worth considering, it has some very serious implications for people who are now on aid.
Mac, you talked about the revenue projections. I think your phrasing was a little bit optimistic, or at least you were talking about capital gains.
Yeah.
A little bit optimistic. Can you clarify a little bit? And also, too, in the context, we've had optimistic revenue projections lots of times in recent years. Where does this fall into that?
Well, I think we wouldn't have raised it and made such a big point if we didn't think there was some considerable downside risk to it. And again, you can look at the chart that we have in the document that shows the trends as forecast by our office and finance, and there's some pretty significant differences. I think you just have to consider on that chart the kind of monetary differences with relatively small changes in those numbers. If you are forecasting, Jason, what do we have? Roughly 70 billion in capital gains versus finance's 90 billion. That translates into a lot of extra revenue. And the point is, I guess, John, is that we can't forecast taxpayer behavior. No one's particularly, good at that. But in order to get the kind of gains that the administration is forecasting, it kind of looks like you need pretty good improvement in both capital markets and in housing markets. And we're not forecasting that in our underlying economic forecast, and we don't really see finance forecasting that either. So we're just not sure how they get to their numbers.
So by context of recent years, would you call this more optimistic than some have been?
Well, I think that's kind of hard. Remember also, we're focusing on these high-income taxpayers. The governor's proposal focuses on them, so everything becomes more concentrated now as PIT becomes a bigger part of our overall funding source, as higher income taxpayers become a more important part of that more important revenue source. The differences tend to be magnified. So yes, we do think it's on the optimistic side, but I don't want to give anybody the impression that we're not going to have these differences in the future. I think it's just part of the game now.
Mac, the governor wants many of the cuts, in particular CalWORKs, to be made by March. Democratic leaders have kind of said, no, we want to wait till May and see if we have to make any cuts at all, or if revenues are going to come back and make that unnecessary. How soon, in your mind, does the legislature need to start cutting this year? This calendar year?
That's a really tough one because let's say the legislature doesn't want to cut in the areas the governor wants to. Then there isn't quite the need to start early as the governor's proposal, because many type of proposed solutions in the health and human services areas require more lead time because of getting federal approval or notifications. So the tough trade-off is, well, the legislature may have other ideas about what it wants to cut and could afford to wait if it's not in those areas. Or it may be that they just want to wait and are willing to forego a couple of months' savings because they want to wait and see if maybe the revenues improve. So it's a really hard one to answer.
Given that lead time, I mean, do you guys anticipate any downside if the legislature does accept these cuts to CalWORKs, either in tax revenues or in legal challenges? I mean, it seems every time Health and Human Services is cut, there's questions about whether the feds will accept it and what will happen in court.
Well, and I think one reason why maybe we kind of go to the CalWORKs well is that we do tend to have a lot more flexibility with the federal government because they just give us a block grant, and then we have a lot of freedom within that on how to devise our program. So in some ways, in other health and human service programs, you don't have that kind of flexibility where you both have uncertainty as to whether you can achieve the savings because you don't know if either the federal government will give you approval and or whether the courts will intervene in ways that we've seen on all sorts of reimbursement rate issues and other.
Back to follow up on that point. I just want to follow up on that point. The way in which they achieve that savings is by shifting that block grant money to Cal grants. Do you think is that acceptable?
I think that is. We've done similar things in the past, and the federal government doesn't seem to have a problem with that.
Does that money need to be earmarked for people who would otherwise qualify for TANF?
Almost all of those people are low income, so I think almost by definition, Kevin, they fall within that realm.
There have been concerns in past years about budget gimmicks. Last year you said the governor's budget proposal was more straightforward. How does this one stack up against other years as far as just in the use of one-shot measures, gimmicks, and other things like that?
Well, I mean, we try to stay away from the word gimmicks because people define it so differently. Some people have used the term with regard to any one-time reductions, and I don't think that's appropriate. You can use one-time reductions. There's nothing wrong with that. I think the gimmicks are stuff that we think that you either really don't have a very good chance of achieving the savings, or what also tends to fall in that area is when you're maybe deferring expenses and just doing accounting things that's really not changing your underlying fiscal situation.
Right.
So I wouldn't say that he has lots of gimmicks. There are some one-time things in here. He has some additional borrowing, both on deferring special fund loans that we've already made. He proposed to defer the repayments to later years. He has additional loans on to pay off our unemployment insurance costs that we make to the federal government. So there are several one-time things. In some of those cases, they will make our problem a little bit worse later on because you'll now be repaying those in out years. But I'm not sure dramatically different from what we've done in the past.
Mac, that's kind of an off-the-wall question, but so the capital gains, stock options are oftentimes driven by activities at single companies, single events. So, for instance, a public offering by Facebook could just a single event like that make up the difference between your forecast and theirs?
I would say no, not make up the difference, but it could have a significant effect. We actually have some description of the whole Facebook issue in the brief. And it's something that we've tried to take into account already in building in some of that likely greater than average IPO-related revenue. But we're going to be taking a look at that, and when we come out in February, we'll speak more to it. And it may be that there is some upside there on that issue on top of what we've already built in. And so there is reason to believe that could help, but I don't think not closing, in any way closing that gap.
You continue that same, when you have your chart here on page 13, you're showing the difference between yourself and the government. Revenue matters about a $2.5 billion difference from round numbers. That is your November forecast, right?
Yes.
But you say on a couple of pages later, you imply at least that you may be reducing your revenue estimates because of the 2010 tax data, more recent data. So the what I'm asking is it potentially possible that your difference between the governor and yourself will grow because of that?
It is possible.
Is this likely, would you say?
Well, I think here's what we were hanging on to. If you just looked at what happened in December on the kind of first, a lot of people when they make that first estimated payment, a lot of people will pay in December for tax purposes. And so we didn't do particularly well in December related to those estimated payments. But Dan, we don't know if it's just that lots of changes and that people will make it up by January 15th. And that's why I say we will know a lot more by the end of the month, and certainly it will be reflected in our forecast in February. But if we don't recover, yes, we could be even worse than we were in November.
You're probably aware that Mr. Thornburg has taken the opposite tack, that the governor's being too conservative by about $4 billion, he figures. Have you looked at his?
Well, remember, he doesn't do revenue forecast. He does economic forecast.
He does, yeah. But
So I don't have a revenue
He attached a revenue number to it.
Well, he
said about
also,
$4 billion.
several months ago, he thought that the $4 billion that we added was not appropriate to do. So, he's changed his mind, and that's his prerogative. But he doesn't, as far as I know, he doesn't do revenue forecasts, so I don't have anything to compare against.
Mark, how do you see this year in comparison with other years? Are we moving forward? Or
Yes, I think we're definitely moving forward. As I said, we had reduced because of improved economics and revenues last year and actions they took to reduce spending on an ongoing basis. We've more than cut our problem in half. The governor, whether you have the revenues that are approved by the people in November or his backup trigger plans, would achieve additional savings that pretty much close to brings us into balance, not only for this year but for future years. So yes, I think we will have made, if we do something similar to what the governor proposes, we will have made dramatic progress in solving our problem.
And do you consider a good idea this initiative to increase taxes, or legislators should look for another plan B in order to avoid these trigger cuts?
Well, I think what we suggested and what I talked about the Prop 98 is that, because that's most of the trigger cuts, that's 90%. The legislature needs to think carefully about the implications for his proposal for 1213 and what it means for schools. So yeah, I think they should think about alternatives. Not that there are good choices, but I think they can think about different ways to deal with the situation if the voters were not to approve his tax proposal.
And you talked a minute ago about that, and you said that the legislature might have some alternatives in front of it in terms of possibly giving the schools the money up front or some of it up front. Can you elaborate on that? What are some of the alternatives the legislature would have?
The legislature could just come in and say, you know what, there's a lot of uncertainty this year. And yet, in order for you not to have to kind of figure out, do I plan on the basis of having the monies in November or not, they could just say, you know what, for this year, this first year, we're just going to provide you with this amount of money. They would have certainty, they would know what their budgets were for that year, and then they could just proceed. The problem is, at what level do you give them that certainty? Is it going to be the same level that they would end up under the governors if the measure is not approved? And maybe the legislature feels like that's not where they want them to be, that they're willing to give them a higher level, that they don't take any cuts or they're flat, whatever it is that they choose. The problem is, though, they then have to make sure that the rest of the budget is balanced, that there's enough solutions there in order to make sure that the budget they pass by July 1 is in balance.
And then with regards to the possible overestimation by finance on the capital gains increases, if it turns out that they are overestimating that, are there triggers associated with that?
No, not now.
Okay.
So I think it's, again, why we're suggesting they don't need to act right now. They need to wait and see where they are, either in February, or they may want to just wait till May, just because of the uncertainty surrounding the numbers. And they'll be in a much better situation to kind of see, well, what is it, that kind of cuts do we need to impose? What is our backup plan? So I think that is the tension that they're going to feel, of kind of wanting to wait to have a really clearer picture in May after the April 15th revenues have come in, with this trade-off that if it does turn out that we're closer to being right, for example, they not only would have to take actions that the governor wants them to take, they might have to take more, and they would have less time to do it. That's a very tough trade-off. I don't know quite how to advise them on that.
Matt, on this 1213 revenue chart here, there's a $3.2 billion gap between you and the governor now. That's excluding the trigger. So do you add the 2 points on the revenue? I mean, the passage of the initiative.
Yes.
So in addition to that, you already have a $2.1 billion difference if the initiative is passed, right? So if the initiative passes, your gap jumps to 5.2 billion, 5.3. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about on top of what we're showing on this chart.
Okay.
Matt, on the Facebook, can we go back to the Facebook effect?
Sure.
In here it says that you have built in extra revenue into your modeling in 2010, 11, and 12. Could you tell us how and why you do that?
Well, I think this is the kind of revenue estimating, not as science, but as a part art. You try to reconcile what your models are generating in your forecast with what you're seeing in cash collections, and reconciling it with past data, with economic data. And so what we did is we kind of sometimes we'll make adjustments, and it may just be to help do that reconciliation, and in part it was knowing that the Facebook effect was out there, that we thought we could capture some of that also.
So, but you wouldn't then need to go in and readjust your model if there was an IPO?
Well, but if there is an IPO, the point is we may not have fully captured the possible upside of that. So that's what we're going to be taking on a closer look at. And it may be that's one of the reasons why we're different from finance. They may have built in a more optimistic assumption about the revenues that we can accrue from Facebook. We've talked with them about it. We're not sure that's the case, but it might explain part of the difference. But in any case, I think that's one thing that's just one more kind of X factor in the whole capital gains issue.
And you wouldn't be able to actually see the actual revenue from that IPO until at least April 2013, is that, if I'm reading the
Well, there may be some evidence, just because of the limited number of taxpayers, but obviously have confidentiality problems and knowing those things. But there may be some evidence as to what came in from that IPO, should it in fact occur. Wyatt, let me go to you.
Yeah, on Prop 98, you've had different guarantee numbers than finance. Have you done a calculation on what the guarantee would be, from your perspective, if the revenues pass?
If the revenues pass. Well,
You all had a 51.3
Right.
prior without them.
this is a really tough one. I might have Jen Kuhn help me out here, our Deputy for Education. But there are so many differences, Wyatt, in the Prop 98 calculations. Let me just kind of list a few. There's how do you treat the revenues from the sales tax realignment? And as you may know, that's currently in litigation. So there's an issue there and whether that's included in your baseline or not. There's issues that the governor's proposing on rebenchings, both in new ones, on the debt service associated with schools, but also in the way that they would change the rebenchings we did in the current year on mental health. There's a proposal now to change the way that we treat the gas tax swap. So there's policy issues, there's technical issues about how you do rebenchings, there's difference of opinions on legal issues, then there's our different revenues. And I'd almost need a huge matrix to show all the different combinations of those. So I don't have an easy answer to your question. We make our own assumptions of our baseline, and so we would have different numbers, but we haven't kind of gone through that completely right now.
Matt, can I just follow up on that question?
Sure.
I mean, there are two pieces in there that are pretty significant. I mean, the realignment shift of the sales tax, and also this geo bond shift, rebenching. I mean, do you think that those are legal? Are they appropriate? I mean, how solid are those? Because those are the ways in which you would achieve the lower 98 number.
Under the trigger.
Under the trigger mechanism.
Exactly. I think let's start with the debt service one. And again, this is a case where we have not included the debt service on K-12 bonds in our Prop 98 calculations. We've never done that. And what the governor's proposing to do is to include those. But he's proposing to go back to 1986-87, and whatever we spent on debt service then, we would put into our base and kick it up, and then we would now include all of our spending this year in our Prop 98 calculation. The problem is that back then it was a very small amount. It was less than 100 million, I think, Jim? Something like that, very small amount. Now it's about 2.6 billion. So it has implications for the rest of the Prop 98 budget. If you're now pushing a lot of these expenses into the calculation, they in effect have to take a cut of about 2.4 billion, and that's the way that he achieves a big part of his trigger reductions. Sure. So I think it poses both. I think there could be a legal challenge to it, Kevin. I guess it would be that after all this time, why are you changing things after some 30 years or 20 years, whatever. I think from a policy basis, it raises some really interesting questions of, when are we going to go in? When do you kind of lock down what's included in 98, and how long is it open for changes? There is this issue of, is it appropriate or good policy to put in this factor, which clearly does bounce around a lot more than the limit. We have big bond issues, and debt service goes up, it can drop back down. So you can argue there was a good reason why we didn't include debt service originally, and that's more of a policy issue as opposed to the legal issue. And let me just finish up, though, on your other point about how to treat the sales tax realignment revenue. That issue goes away if the voters approve the governor's tax measure, because it constitutionally says how we can treat those, that we don't have to deal with them. If it's defeated, though, then you have the issue that's basically in front of the court now. Now, the legislature, through statute, has said, if the voters do not approve the measure, we want you to, in effect, treat spending as it were had you not done the realignment. And so our baseline would be higher because we will have to go back in and make a settle-up obligation and bump the base up.
So the legislature would have to change that statute, or we'd have to change statute too.
If it didn't want to do that. It could
to achieve the governor's cut.
Well, Jen, you may have to help me out on that one. To achieve their cut. That may be true, yes.
Well, and it's not going to be quite that straightforward because I don't think it's repealing existing statute. It's also going to be what is your constitutional interpretation of what happens in the absence of statute. And then it's going to be, well, can you still do it, but you just need a formal suspension. They're all going to be wrapped up in it.
This is not easy stuff. We're still sorting through all of the Prop 98 changes that the governor's proposing.
You mentioned that the state's making progress with addressing the budget problems, but there's also a lot of talk about uncertainty. Is uncertainty increasing in the budget as opposed to past years?
Well, I think to the extent yeah, that PIDS is becoming more of our major funding source, yes, I'd say we have even greater volatility.
Last year, your office had recommended that the administration reevaluate some of the AB 900 prison projects. They're doing so. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and again, I might need some help here from Brian back there. But they are doing that, and I think that's very appropriate. We had a lot of felons in so-called non-traditional beds and dormitories, program space, in corridors. I mean, it was not a good situation. We are already making dramatic progress in getting those people out. As we eliminate more felons, as we do the realignment, over time, we hope to get rid of all that non-traditional space. And so that then raised the question, do we need other beds? So I think the governor is in effect doing what we had recommended, taking a fresh look and putting on hold, at least for now, any additional capital facilities.
And can you just expand also on the Division of Juvenile Justice remarks you guys made? It seems like you think this is a good idea, but there's some uncertainty. Well,
yeah, I think there's a lot of things they're going to have to figure out because similar to the realignment for the low-level felons, the locals have to put these people somewhere. And you're talking about 58 counties with 58 very different situations. Some may easily have the space and the room, the type of facilities and the capacity to handle these people right away, and it's not going to be a huge deal for them. Other may not have any space or may not have the space that can handle. These are pretty tough folks here we're talking about, and may not feel like they have the kind of space that is appropriate to keep them in. So I think more of our issues would be in the kind of transitional of how do you get from where we are now to where we'd like to be. But I think conceptually, we think the governor's proposal makes a lot of sense. It's things that we've recommended in the past.
Your office has now evaluated, I guess, several of the proposed tax measures that could go on the November ballot.
Yes.
And I wonder, if you think that one, whether it's the governor's or another one, would be most effective in your mind of taking care of the deficit, or if none of them would, or.
Well, they're very different. Some don't have much in addressing the state's problem. A lot of it's for just additional spending, and a piece of it may be for the budget. I think the Munger initiative is a mix. Its impact relative to the governor, we haven't looked at something like that. But they're very different purposes, so it's kind of hard to evaluate them because some do go in and increase the 98, others don't. Then, of course, the governor's is temporary. Many of the other measures are ongoing. So it's very hard to say, and we just haven't reached those kind of conclusions as to now.
Yesterday, Mac, I interviewed a Medi-Cal recipient who was pretty upset that the state was putting high-speed rail above, social services. I mean, any thoughts on having a line item for high-speed rail in this tough budget?
Well, first of all, the governor does not have a proposal yet on high-speed rail. So it's waiting for the final business plan, and he said he will come out sometime in the future. Anthony? Sometime in the spring. So we don't know exactly what the governor's proposing. And then, of course, we would appropriate certain monies, and then you would issue the bonds, the debt service. So I don't even know what the effect would be in 12-13. Clearly, in out years, if we were to proceed with the project, the debt service on the bonds would be considerable. And there are trade-offs with not just health and social service, with all the budgets, schools and everything. So, the legislature has a very tough choice if, in fact, the governor proposes to move ahead with the project, especially in light of the peer review groups' rather definitive conclusions that they came out with recently. So that's going to be a tough one for them.
Does your office, on that subject, I know you all put the thing out several months ago, your look at that business plan at that point. Do you intend to come back, dip into this issue again, given the legislative action that has to happen?
Oh, absolutely. I think at this point, though, we'd wait and see what the governor proposes and then comment at that point. Yeah.
I was wondering, in your report, you recommend the legislature go ahead and budget less for education and maybe not do the trigger route. And I'm wondering how does that work, especially when the Democratic-controlled legislature doesn't want to do any more cuts?
Well, I think this is what we talked about. And I think that's not exactly our characterization of it. What we said is that the governor's plan, because of the trigger proposal, the $4.9 billion in cuts to schools that would occur if you don't pass the measure, the governor's proposal in 12-13 would in effect signal to schools that they should take those cuts. And what we're saying is the legislature just needs to be aware of the implications in 12-13 of the governor's proposal. They may be thinking that if the voters approve of the measure, schools will have all this extra money and programmatically will be increasing the level of the program that they're now providing. that may not be the case because they have to budget on a worst-case scenario. So what we were suggesting is the legislature may want to evaluate that. It may not want to make it contingent on whether the voters approve it or not for 1213, because knowing that many school districts, perhaps even most, will budget on the basis of a worst-case scenario. They may not want that. So we're just trying to highlight this point and make sure they're aware they do have some alternatives. They're not necessarily great ones, but they do have alternatives in the way that they approach schools. Yeah.
Do you have any sense of how many districts have treated past deferrals as cuts? In other words, not built them into the programmatic budget?
Oh boy, Jen, help me out here.
Well, it's been growing, so we only have survey data on it, but as of a couple of years ago, it was about 20% of districts were cutting as opposed to borrowing to support the program. And then when the state did a relatively large new deferral in 11-12, our survey respondents, at least, that went up to about 40%. And then we did another large one as part so it is probably an increasing share. I think for when deferrals were relatively small budget, most folks were borrowing, whether it would be in-house in their own reserves or externally, but more and more districts are cutting. Less than half are probably actually treating it as a cut today, and even then they might be borrowing for a portion of it and cutting for a portion of it.
Is it the ones who didn't treat it as a cut that would be hurt more by the trigger plan? Or do you have any sense of that?
Those actually who are running out of borrowing options, under the governor's plan, all he actually does is pay down some of the existing deferrals. This is going to help all districts, and then all districts would essentially be affected by this $2.4 billion general purpose revenue limit cut. And if they're doing worst case, because they're having to issue pink slips here in March, a few months from now, they're probably very likely going to budget and size their programs for 12-13, assuming that revenue doesn't exist, right? Because they're not going to know until halfway through their school year when students have teachers and teachers are hired and class sizes have been negotiated and lengths of school years have been negotiated. It's all going to be done before November. So I think all we're suggesting is the legislature should be careful because the signal it sends about the trigger is very likely the program that will get in 12-13.
But that legislative signal has to happen soon again, given the March world of districts, right?
Well, I would say, though, at least before July 1.
What about, in terms of these school cuts, the Republicans have called it a Washington Monument strategy. I've just thrown it out there. In your mind, are the trigger cuts realistic as to what would have to happen if the revenue isn't there?
Well, they're concentrated in schools. There's no doubt about it. And on the other hand, though, because schools is such a large part of the budget, any trigger reductions would have to have some impact on schools. But the legislature obviously doesn't have to go with the governor's mix. It has other options for these sort of contingent cuts, if that's in fact what they want to do again.
Mac, you said in the report, to follow up on that the legislature could just budget what they can afford for schools and then count the tax revenue from or any additional revenue from the tax measure as a bonus, if I'm understanding the way you explain that.
Yeah, I mean, if that's true. They could either pay down more deferrals or give the schools the cash, and they could begin their planning for the following year. At that point, but when we have the election, they know kind of what the situation looks like a little more so for the future. But yeah, at least they would have certainty, and it may be that it would be the legislature would choose a different level. Maybe it'd be a little higher, maybe it'd be the same, but at least schools would have that certainty and could kind of take it from there.
Have you? I thought there have been IPOs throughout the years. I don't think that any one company was singled out in an LAO analysis.
I think it's just the size of this one.
Okay.
This is huge. Jason, potentially four times bigger than Google. Is that?
This could be the biggest internet IPO ever. So, and it's a California company.
Mac, to beat a bit dead horse one more time.
Did you have something? I'm sorry.
Oh.
Do you have a follow-up?
Well, just
Okay.
I didn't hear. I mean, I don't know if you can reiterate it, but I mean, it's.
Yeah, it was just this is the largest one that we've ever seen. I mean, it's much bigger than Google, which was probably the biggest one we'd had. And so this is a little unique because of the size, the potential size of the offering. And so I think people have raised it. We get asked a lot about it, so we felt it was appropriate to talk about the potential impact.
To beat a dead horse one more time.
Okay.
The still shows signs of life. If you take the difference between you and the governor on the baseline revenues for this year, and you add into it your differences on what the ballot measure would produce, it would appear that overall that you and he are something in excess of $5 billion apart on the amount. That's,
For the 3 years.
That's
for the 3 years.
For 3 years.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money. I mean, is it? How do you reconcile that at the end of the final analysis?
Well, reconcile in what way?
Well, the governor, I guess the legislature picks a number and that's it?
Well, I think there's one important factor. Remember, anytime you have the revenue differences, you do have the related Prop 98 effects. So you could have, if revenues turn out to be lower, it does tend to reduce your Prop 98. So it means that the effect on your budget isn't necessarily the full amount of the number that you mentioned, or whatever that difference would be. But yeah, it does pose, a potential concern, I'm sure, for the members that they not only have to take these cuts and actions in addition to what the governor's proposing on the revenues, that they might have to do more. But we think it's just better that they're aware of that possible downside risk now, as opposed to getting to May and being surprised all of a sudden. I think they would be even more upset if they hadn't had any forewarning of that. And again, we may turn out to be wrong. It could go either direction. We could be worse off from where we are. We could be above where finance is. The volatility around these numbers are just extremely large, the variation around them.
You mentioned volatility. But my calculations, the governor's numbers would turn out to be the way he projects them to be. The personal income tax would wind up providing about 62% of the state's revenue stream.
Yeah, that's about right, about 3/5.
Is it time that the governor and the legislature did something about tax reform, and along the lines that reform commission proposed, to try to reduce that volatility? Or it seems that the volatility seems to be getting, as we become more dependent on the PIT, the volatility goes up. You get these big differences between you and the governor over what a handful of rich people are going to be doing in the stock market, basically. The only way out of that would seem to change the tax system.
Well, it's not the only way out, Dan.
No, it's not.
As
we've set up a reserve, you can do other things.
If you set up a very strong reserve mechanism, if your budgetary practices tend to go with the lower revenue estimates when you have a range, there are other things you can do short of changing your revenue structure, but
it's a growing problem.
It's a growing problem, and it does suggest that you should also look at other ways that you could reduce the inherent volatility in your revenue structure, particularly if you don't think that you can either achieve those kind of budgetary reforms and sort of traditions on the way that you budget for this volatile revenue scheme. So I think that should be in the mix.
Using what Dan was talking about, but as an explanatory element for the public who doesn't follow every bit of this, talk about why we're more dependent on the PIT now than we've been in years past. What's changed with revenue stream? Just some comment that gives us a sense of context.
I think there's two basic reasons. First of all, we have most of our revenues from sales tax and the personal income tax. The sales tax has become much less important over time. A smaller percentage of our economy are the purchase of tangible products, cars, things that you can touch or feel, whatever that is. And then on the other hand, the personal income tax, even absent those trends in the sales tax, has become a more important part because of this concentration of high-income taxpayers and the amount of taxable capital gains, the housing market, and things like that. So PIT has become more important at the same time as the sales tax has become less important.
And given those long-term trends, the governor's proposal seems to ante up even more.
Yes, I think that's fair.
Mac, you also said that the administration chooses to account for the Bush tax cuts expiring, and that investors might move some capital gains because of the potential Medicaid taxes. Do you have a number to associate how that would be different just on those two?
I think we've been looking at several hundred millions. Jason, is that the best? Again, it's a contributing factor to differences between years. And certainly the finance assumption is extremely reasonable because that's kind of current law. We just went with a different assumption because it was consistent with the underlying economic U.S. data that we get.
But the difference is in what year that revenue is going to be scored, as opposed to this year.
That's for the most part.
Finance or forward-looking.
For the most part, it washes out over a 2-year period. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.